welcome to RealAg Live, everybody. Thanks a lot for tuning in here this afternoon. Hope you're having yourselves a great Tuesday. We're going to really have some fun today. One of my favorite topics, a very important topic to you as well. It is Canada, China. I almost said Canada, US, China. Maybe that's the trifecta, the three-legged stool. We'll get to some of that here in a little bit. We're going to be joined by some great guests today, some experts on this topic, and I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm also looking forward to your participation in the program as well. So you get a chance to ask your questions, provide your comments. We'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. All you have to do is enter them in the comment box, whether you're watching on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, or Twitch. And let's have some fun here together and learn. There's a new report out from the Canada West Foundation all about what Canada-China trade relations should look or could look like in the future. Let's bring in our guests. And first up, it is a familiar face to many of you, Carlo Dade of the Canada West Foundation. Carlo, how are you?
Shaun, always a pleasure to be here. And you see, I've learned in my past experiences. I bought some help this time.
Yeah, that's good. I appreciate that. The phone a friend concept. Also joining us is Sharon, son of the Canada West Foundation as well. Sharon, how are you?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here too. So Sharon, introduce yourself to the Real Agriculture audience. Give us some of your background.
Sure. So I'm the trade policy economist with Canada West Foundation, and my focus is on trade and trade infrastructure with China and the Asia Pacific. So we recently had a new report out focusing on how to address China's non-tariff barrier issues for Canadian agriculture.
Cool. And sorry, how long have you been there?
I think I'm going into my third year now with Canada West.
Oh, wow. Cool stuff. You can give us some secrets, some maybe Carlo's stories later. I would appreciate
Sure.
I would appreciate some of those. So Carlo, break down for us, I guess, why this report now?
Sure. Just let me note that Sharon actually came to us from a PhD program at Carleton University. So one of my trips back east, I got her to move out west and join us, and her focus is Canada-China trade. So it's been a real addition to Canada West, to Western Canada, having her come out as a resource, but also to work on agricultural trade. And part of this was behind our recent report. So you know that we've been focused on agricultural trade issues with Western Canada and Canada writ large. The work that we did on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, making sure that Canada stayed in the agreement, making the case for Canada to continue and to take a leadership in the TPP, has been part of the focus on agriculture. So there's a natural transition to thinking about our second largest agricultural market, Canada's second largest trade market in general, and that's China. Of course, I think all of the listeners in Canada and even the States are familiar with the trade tensions and difficulties that we've had in Canada in our trade with China, again, our second largest trade partner. So we decided a year ago to take a look to see if there was something new that could be done in terms of resolving or at least mitigating trade tensions around non-tariff barriers. These are the extrajudicial measures or the use or abuse or misuse, abuse or misuse of trade rules to slow the flow or to harm the flow of goods. And in doing that, we started out by looking at lessons from countries that are similar to Canada's profile. So New Zealand, Australia, Brazil, a country we don't often think about in Canada, but that has extensive trade ties with China. And we learned a lot from each of these countries. But while we were going through this, the US-China Phase 1 trade agreement suddenly dropped. And looking at this, we immediately saw large potential negative impacts on Canadian agricultural trade with China from this agreement. We also saw that the agreement was causing problems for China, potential increased dependency on the US. We can go into this. The report takes a deep dive into this. But the issue was there was suddenly this new convergence of interest between China and Canada on agricultural trade. For a country that's so concerned about food security that it's a subject on which regimes can rise or fall, becoming more dependent on a U.S. that's openly hostile to China, that's used food as a political weapon in the past, is a serious problem. For Canada, having the U.S. essentially shiv us in the back by signing an agreement that prioritizes U.S. agriculture at the expense of Canadian agriculture, and having done so after the NAFTA negotiations, where they told us in Canada, don't you dare think about negotiating an agreement with China. And then 2 months later, they turn around and say, oh, by the way, we just signed an agreement with China that threw Canadian farmers under the tractor. We both have problems. And the thinking behind the report is this new convergence of interest enough to spark a rethink on both sides of the importance of the relationship? And to back that up, we looked at the longer convergence of interest between Canada and China in agricultural trade, recasting the relationship through a deeper examination of data and a quantitative analysis and a qualitative analysis of the potential importance of Canada. Finally, we also went back into Canadian history. This is not the first time we faced the situation of being caught between China and the US on agricultural trade. In the 1950s, the Diefenbaker government essentially had to stand up to US demands that Canada not sell grain to China during China's greatest famine, during the height of the Cold War. So a government that came from the prairies was able to stand up for Western interest and to stand up for Canadian interest and to navigate between the tensions between China and the US. Obviously, in the intervening decades, China has become more important as a trade partner. It's no longer a nice to have, it's a necessity to have. And China's also become a lot more powerful. So those tensions are a bit different, but the basic predicament is the same. And as we show in the report, we managed to navigate it in the past, and certainly we can reach out to do so again.
Sharon, you have done a tremendous amount of quantitative research on not only Canada's trading relationship with China, but also many countries. And Carlo alluded to some of that in terms of looking at like countries like Canada and in some of the trade volumes. Can you walk us through some of that data?
Sure, absolutely. So as Carlos said, when we initiated this project, we wanted to look at countries that have an agreement with China, such as Australia and New Zealand, and in learning how they addressed some of the issues that we share with China. And then we also looked at Brazil, which is a country that doesn't have a trade agreement with China, that was also able to successfully resolve some of the non-tariff barrier issues on agriculture. When in our discussion, when we were brainstorming on whether or not Canada should continue to engage in China, one of the things we did was to look deeper into the data and to look at the trends. And one of the things that we saw is the continuous growth, the overall steady growth that Canada has had with China over the last 24 years, with an average of 12% per year growth. This is two-way trade growth. And that's compared to the US as 3%. So yes, US is still Canada's largest trading partner, but the growth of China is there and is unavoidable. And then, so when we looked at these trends and we dive deeper into agriculture, we see the same trends, the same growth trends. Of course, in recent years, we've had tensions that resulted in very targeted and narrow set of sectors that were impacted. And that includes soybeans, canola, and canola oils. So for example, from 2018 to 2019, we saw a decline of almost 97% of soy export from Canada to China. So when times are bad, when we have bad relations, we do see that it impacts our trade. But what we see is actually very narrow and targeted trade. And what's not talked about in the news cycle is that there are actually continuous growth in agricultural export between Canada and China in that same period. in other sectors, in other agricultures. And that includes peas and wheat. And this is something that we don't see in the news cycle. So from our research, it really shows that we can't just walk away from China and we can't just disengage, because while there are some products that are very targeted right now because of all-time low, our trade is still growing even during this time, and particularly from 2019 to 2020, maybe because of COVID-19 impact.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to conclude that because of how much we rely on China and how much this is growing, diversification is more difficult than we imagine.
Yeah, difficult but not impossible. But the cost is so large, it calls into question just how realistic that strategy would be. You have to remember that this growth of trade has been occasioned by private sector actors. So companies, and on the import side, individuals making choices every day. We do not have a command and control economy. On the other side, we do have China, where the government can make or can influence decisions. We don't have that capacity on our side. So this growth, it's important to state that this growth didn't just happen by itself. It was the choice of individual actors and companies pursuing return on investment and value to shareholders. And that's the way our system works here in Canada. And the result shows up clearly in the data.
Well, throughout the Trump presidency, it's really felt that Canada has been somewhat frozen, caught between these two superpowers. We have President-elect Biden, and now it seems like all of a sudden this week, after a couple weeks of Conservative leader Erin O'Toole talking a lot tougher on China, the Liberals are doing the same thing this week. It's all of a sudden become somewhat of the popular strategy, I think, to start talking tougher. Carlo, how does that fit into this equation of trying to have a better trade relationship?
It's part of it. So in the immediate analysis, with the analysis in the news cycle, you tend to focus, because of the structure of the discussion, on the issue or topic of the moment. But when you step back and take a broader view and you look at what our allies, US, Australia, our allies who are also our competitors are doing, they're managing to do both. So when you take a wider view, yes, you absolutely have to push back on political issues. You have to push back on trade frictions and tension. But at the same time, you can engage on trade where it's growing, and you can even engage in new initiatives. So as much of a beating as Australia's taken, they've just also signed a new multi-party pact with China. As much of a beating as the US is taking, the US is waging almost a hot war with China. Yeah. Yet, during that process, they signed what? A new trade agreement to increase agricultural trade. So you can walk and chew gum at the same time. I would argue in most other countries, it's only Canada where we sit back and watch our allies who are our competitors doing both, yet we're only doing one thing. We haven't matched what our allies / competitors are doing in the full term of engagement.
You know, a lot of times we focus on, food scarcity and, trying to make sure that people are fed in China as being one of the main pushes here. And even use Australia as the example. Some of the reaction from China is, I guess the way you've put it is sort of like it's a PR strategy, where it's they say they ban Australian barley, for example, but the reality is maybe they could just know they can get barley from somewhere else, and it's just a kind of part of the PR stunt, and we take it too much at sort of face value that it means more than it really does. Is that fair?
If we put the same framework of analysis for China and our trade tensions with China that we have with the US, there would be calls in this country to withdraw from the new NAFTA agreement. I mean, we signed the NAFTA agreement, and a couple months afterward, President Trump is threatening to reimpose steel and aluminum tariffs. We have calls immediately for enforcement actions under the new agreement for all those and other things when it's only a couple months old. We still have no resolution of softwood lumber. the threat to declare uranium a security threat to the U.S., all those as a security threat. You can go on and on and on. But the reality is, despite those tensions, a couple $1 billion a day still miraculously somehow crosses the border. So we need to apply the same framework for other trade relations. And there are tons of reasons why we don't. History, culture, and you can take that list to its logical conclusion.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
There's
Sharon.
definitely needs to be engagement at all levels, as you said, specifically at the multilateral level on bigger issues where Canada can more actively participate with its allies. But at the same time, Canada also needs to engage on its own bilaterally and provincially and at the business levels. The industry needs to be there. And we see that in our allies that are also our competitor. We see that in Australia. We see that in US. Australia, of course, they're having issues right now on barley, but this is not the first time that they've had issues, just like how this is not the first time we've had issues with the US. There will always be new issues that needs to be addressed. But the fact that there are structures and framework that are there between Australia and China, that are there between US and China, that we have with US, between Canada and US, that we don't have with China. This is what is important.
And not engaging will not do anything to advance our interest in China. Not engaging will not help resolve political or trade tensions, or we'll get the hostages back sooner. Not engaging will only help our competitors who are continuing to engage in the Chinese market. So we really need to approach this from a sense of real interest. Again, I would go back to the same way that the Diefenbaker government did in terms of its dealings when the U.S. tried to force us to join their embargo of grain, southern grain, to China right after the Korean War, right after we were both facing Chinese troops in Korea. Canada still found its way to pursue its interest in a path that was different from the U.S. And so there is that bit of our history that we can lean on for inspiration. As I said yesterday, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So there are things that we can learn from the past to apply to today.
Sharon, you mentioned engaging at all levels. I heard yesterday the three of us participated in a panel for Grains Week, and you talked about how we need to have more boots on the ground. When Canada compares itself to, say, Australia, we are very, very under-resourced from a people perspective on the ground in China. For a country like Canada that's trying to trade more and also get hostages back, as Carlo alluded to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not surprising that Australia is more present there because China is Australia's largest trading partner, and there is also a distance factor involved. So Australia is definitely more involved, not only in China, but also in that region. Canada, as we've relied on US for so long that now we are beginning to consider. I mean, we've considered diversification. Our diversification has always been part of our agenda. But now we're really focusing on Asia because of its development and because of China's growth. And for that reason, we definitely need to catch up on this aspect. We need to have more Chinese speaking or China culturally or business etiquette competent professionals on the ground. I think Carlo, you always say a famous line. I think you said, for every one Australian rep that's there needs to be a Canadian rep.
Yeah, every time someone in China hears, "Good day, mate, like to talk to you about beef," there needs to be someone behind him saying, "Hey, beef, eh? Yeah, I got something for you." And this competency needs to also be here in Canada. Again, we're not talking about China doing China a favor or being nice to China. We're talking about our second largest customer. This is basic business service. If you have a customer that's growing at 12% a year, you need to invest resources in servicing that customer. So Mandarin language capacity in Canadian food inspection agencies, so we can assure the Chinese when they come that we are meeting requirements. It's basic business service. And again, If it's our second largest market, we need to up our game to reflect that.
Okay, but to be fair, I'm not hearing from the Conservative Party, the Liberals, business is business. This week, Ambassador to the UN Bob Ray compared the Uyghur situation in China to genocide-like activity. We're really pushing human rights and going after that to try to change behavior in China. But you're talking about something else where we need to maybe separate those two, or am I misreading what you're saying?
No, you have it right. We need to do both at the same time. And again, I would point to our history in Canada, and I would point to the strategies and the policies in place by our allies slash competitors. Others are managing this. Whether they're doing it well or not is a separate question, but at least they have figured out that they have to try and engage on all fronts where their interests are reflected. So yes, I would expect continued pressure on human rights and other issues. Not so much pressure, but as a discussion and the discourse on these issues with China. But we're coming across new actors on the global stage that have different governance structures for politics and economics. It's not just China, India. There's a great talk, especially amongst conservatives in this country, that we should rush in and sign an agreement with India. My God, if you've had trade tensions with China, good luck dealing with India. The only reason the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the world's largest trade agreement, got off the ground and got signed was because they kicked India out. So a trade bloc with China had to kick India out to be able to come into being. So that should tell you about what's down the road. And we're going to have to manage these series of dualities in the relationship. But again, we've done it in the past. Our allies slash competitors are doing it now. So it's a strategy that's certainly not impossible.
And the U.S. has this phase one deal, but even that is really being celebrated as one of the reasons for commodity prices being higher and China fulfilling its commitments. But at the same time, there's still a lot of concern in the U.S. that China is actually going to have all this corn and soybeans and ethanol actually delivered and picked up and put on a boat, even right now. So even the U.S. is not necessarily doesn't have this whole thing figured out in terms of how to do business with China, it seems.
No, absolutely. But the U.S.-China Phase 1 agreement has two separate and distinct components. One are the purchase agreements to which you alluded. This is something that President Trump wanted, an easy political victory, 2-year commitments to buy goods. Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. trade rep, the negotiator for the agreement, did not want the purchase commitments. Every chance he got, he downplayed them. When he talked with China, he deliberately mentioned the purchase agreements last to underscore how unimportant they were to him and to the U.S. The bigger change are what Lighthizer calls structural changes to the rules of trade. What the U.S. has is not your everyday trade agreement. It's not the trade agreement that Australia has or New Zealand has. It's a U.S.-style contract. There is no dispute resolution mechanism in this agreement. China has so many days to act when the U.S. sends it information. And if it doesn't comply with that, to say rules for accepting products, the U.S. will send China a list of firms that are allowed to ship beef. China has so many days to publish that list, and then so many days from then to start accepting it. Same thing with infant formula, pork, and other products. This is not a trade agreement. This is a contract. And the dispute resolution mechanism is that the U.S. tells China it's violated something, China can correct it, or the U.S. walks away. So this is a really different type of agreement that gives the Americans certainty. They don't have to worry about non-tariff barriers. They don't have to worry about China suddenly banning canola because this agreement will prevent it. So the Americans have really pulled an amazing feat. The question for us in Canada is, can we get something similar, analogous? Can we get some form of market access security along the lines of what the Americans have? Now, of course, we don't have the muscle to beat an agreement out of China the way the Americans did, but our argument is that this U.S.-China agreement causes problems for China. it makes them more dependent on the US. And China's looking to try and dilute that dependency. They've recently signed a soybean agreement with Russia. They're trying to sign a similar agreement, not on soybeans, but on different commodities in Africa. They're looking to try and dilute the impact of this agreement. And that's where our interests converge with China. And our thinking is there may be at least enough to have a discussion with China about this. Do you see a problem? We think you see a problem because you're running around trying to sign agreements to dilute the impacts of the US agreement. Well, we'd like to talk to you about that because we've got a problem here too.
And you both mentioned Brazil, okay, but China needs Brazilian soybeans to diversify its supply away from the U.S., as you've been alluding to. But they've been claiming some of the same things on COVID-19 being on the packaging of beef coming out of Brazil, just like other countries. So this is a game that China's playing with everybody, and Canada's not the only one that has sort of got sort of the brush back on some of these things. And I hear what you're saying about us taking some of this too personally, as if you can somehow have this utopian perfect relationship with such a powerful economic country like China. Sharon, does that ring true?
Yeah, I think so. Canada is definitely not the only country that is, experiencing these issues. And so that's the reason why I emphasize that we really need to address these issues in many levels, multilateral level, bilaterally, and in different platforms, different tools. One of the things that that we definitely need to communicate with China in our research is we found that yes, in absolute terms, U.S. is one of the U.S. is the second largest wheat supplier to China, right? But when we look at as a supplier, as a stable supplier, we also need to consider quality and stability. And so that in that sense, we need to also take into consideration not only how much absolute terms a country produce, but also how much do we consume and how much do we export and how much do we import. And if we were to take those into consideration, then Canada, for wheat, for example, Canada only produces 26% of what we only consume 26% of what we produce for wheat, right? So as a market who wants certainty, who wants food security and certainty, then Canada is much more attractive as a market compared to US, especially since US is known for using food as a weapon historically. And so this is something that we need to communicate and put forward to China and make this proposition. And of course, we may not be right. Maybe it isn't a threat for China, and they can get back to us and say, your assumptions are wrong. And if that's the case, then we would have to think of new solutions and maybe even more difficult path in terms of disengagement or engagement with China.
Got a question here from Kara, and I think it speaks to this idea of having more people on the ground. That seems like such a simple concept and an easy fix. Obviously, we need some financial budget put to it. But Kara asks, okay, so we need more boots on the ground in China. How do we make our government recognize this? Does it start with some of the the CAFTAs of the world, ag lobby organizations, or how do we make this happen?
So it starts with recognizing that this is not the sole province of government. It's a action, it's an engagement initiative that involves all stakeholders. Obviously, government with government-to-government ties, official recognition, representing CBSA, et cetera, is important. But the industry has to be more on the ground. We've got producer associations that visit, that have staff there. Those have to be increased. So it's not just turning to the government and say, solve our problem for us. It's got to be a joint effort with joint resources, joint financing. The producer associations with the checkoffs certainly have the resources to be able to do more. And I'll just note that, our Australian consultant So we engaged former senior trade negotiators and then senior trade negotiators from Brazil and Australia to help us with this report. And I remember the Australian basically had a comedy routine about Canada's lack of boots on the ground. And it wasn't just the government he was talking about, it was everyone. So we do have folks there who are doing a good job. I don't want to denigrate or downplay what people are doing. But the point is, we just need more. And the point is, it's not just government, it's everyone.
Yeah, and I think there also needs to be intercommunication, but more communication between government and industry in terms of aligning objectives, aligning goals, and approaching China in a more unified and consistent manner. Yeah.
Okay, so if we are going to increase trade with China, do we open free trade negotiations, and do we do that multilaterally, or do we go the U.S. way, which was more of a bilateral agreement? What is the suggested way from your research?
Well, the multilateral way is a long path. The agreements to which China are a member of the new RCEP, RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, first require you to have a bilateral agreement with the ASEAN group of countries, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So you can see that the multilateral path would be a long one, or convincing the Aussies and the Kiwis to sit down with us, or the Brazilians to sit down with us. That's a very long path. The shorter path is obviously the bilateral. The question is whether or not we can go the sectoral route, focus just on agriculture, the way the Americans have done. I would argue that that is a more efficient, means to address our issues. The problem is the sectoral agreement that the American side have signed is the greatest violation of World Trade Organization rules you can imagine. The one thing the World Trade Organization was created to do, the first thing the WTO was created to do, was to prevent partial trade agreements, sectoral agreements. Yet the Americans have blown a hole in that. They've signed sectoral agreements with two of the world's three largest economies, China and Japan. They have one on the books ready to go with Brazil. They're looking at other sectoral agreements. So there's resistance in Canada amongst the government, amongst other trade professionals, in academia. There's resistance against going the partial trade route because of the damage it would do to the WTO. I would posit, on the other hand, that the cow's already out of the barn on that. And while we shouldn't try to undermine the WTO, we should continue to try and strengthen it. At the same time, we have to protect Canadian interests. And if that means engaging in a sectoral agreement in the short term, then so be it.
Yeah, the U.S. kind of masked it, right? So we, at the time of that negotiation, it was phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 even. And it seems like they sort of pulled a fast one where, they made it sound like it was about technology, and there was all these, a change in behavior and state ownership rules. And at the end of the day, it was about the world's largest grain contract that really, really positively impacted some of the Midwestern farm states where President Trump needed some votes. There is other things in that. That's maybe going too far and not being totally fair, but there is no phase 2 or phase 3 at this point. This is the agreement, and so it's tough for Canada to compete with.
Yeah, if you believe there's a phase 2, I got a bridge for you to sell in 2 of the boroughs in New York. Look, the Americans have a history of doing this. The 50s and 60s, again, Public Law 480, where the U.S., under the guise of international development and under the guise of humanitarian efforts, moved large amounts of grain, surplus grain, from the U.S. to developing countries. We immediately called it for what it was in Canada. It wasn't humanitarian. It was a bailout for U.S. farmers. So the Americans have a history of doing this sort of stuff globally and doing it to us in Canada. So again, in terms of thinking through a reaction to China, we will cooperate with the Americans on security. We will cooperate with the Americans on things like Huawei. But where our interests diverge, we are going to have to find our own path and our own strategy.
And Sorry, Sharon, were you going to say something? Okay, I was just going to say there's mounting pressure for Canada to make a decision on Huawei and 5G. Obviously, there's the Madam Meng issue with her being in Vancouver and that extradition court trial. So there's a lot of stuff happening. But like you've said, some of these things can be accomplished in parallel paths. They're not so meshed together that because we're kind of paralyzed if, in a way. I think is a good way to look at it. And I do wonder if a Biden presidency gives Canada some renewed confidence and some cover to maybe step up our game in terms of trying to more aggressively deal with China. So I this has been a very, very fruitful conversation. I appreciate it from both of you.
Hey,
Thank you
it's
so
always
much.
always a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely. The report is from the Canada West Foundation. If people are interested in the report, Carlo, how do they get it?
So just come to the website, cwf.charliewalterfrank.ca. Many of your listeners will have it in the mailbox. We have a great outreach to the ag community, and we do a lot of work with the producer associations and folks in the provinces. So many of you will have it or know someone that does have it. Apologies, the report's 40 pages, and the appendix that goes with it is like 50 pages. So we're apologizing up front. But a lot of work went into this, and the quantitative analysis on things like Canada as a surplus producer. How do we stack up compared to other countries around the globe as a swing producer? Is new information, or it's information I don't think has been presented this way. So there's a heck of a lot in there.
Yeah, great stuff. I've read it, and I encourage others to do the same if you are interested in this file. It's great stuff. Sharon and Carlo, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Yep.
Tomorrow on RealAg Live, we're going to have some fun. Again, we're going to talk more about trade. We're going to have JP Gervais, Chief Economist with Farm Credit Canada. He'll be with us to talk about the opportunities for Canada to expand its trade portfolio globally for agricultural commodities. Thanks, everybody, for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Live, and we'll chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.